Many of us are under the impression that we should only set boundaries with toxic people. But the truth of the matter is, we should be setting boundaries with everyone, including ourselves. I recently did a video about how to set boundaries with yourself. Today, I want to talk about how to set boundaries with your children. So recently, I've been talking about boundaries quite a bit. And the reason is because I'm extremely passionate about this subject. I recognize and realize the importance of us having boundaries in our lives and how life could be changed if we don't have boundaries. When we think about how it applies to our children, the reality is all children thrive off of routine and consistency, and boundaries are the best way to provide that for them. We are our children's example, and if we don't teach them healthy and safe boundaries now, they are going to struggle as adults. I talk to so many people today that want to set boundaries, but because they've never seen them set successfully, they feel guilty or they feel overwhelmed with the process. But it doesn't have to be that way for your children. So let's talk about the steps to creating successful and healthy boundaries between you and your children. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to identify what boundaries you'd like to set regarding your children and why. This is so important because if you don't have an important reason of why you want to set that boundary, you're less likely to follow through. And therefore, it's not a healthy boundary if you're not consistent with it. So for example, you don't really want to set a boundary that says, my children can't ask me any questions if you don't see that there's a good reason for that. But you want to set boundaries that are going to protect both you and your children. So an example of a healthy boundary that you may set for your children is that you're not talking to your children like they're your friend, telling them all your relationship problems or your divorce problems or your personal business in regards to adulthood. This boundary could be important because you don't want children to have information that could hurt them or confuse them. So for example, if you're telling your children all your business about their father and why he's not a good person, then now that's information that can be confusing or overwhelming for them. So setting a boundary like this in play is so important. So the next step is to communicate the boundary with your children. Tell them, you're no longer going to be able to talk to me in that tone. It's disrespectful and I won't allow it. When you communicate this boundary, you're setting the standard not only for yourself, but for your household. And you're setting that expectation and holding them to that. It's so important to communicate. And I think that a lot of people miss this part of it. But this is the best way for your children to learn. This third step is to communicate the consequence and to be consistent. So when you set a boundary, it does nobody any good if you say, well, you can't stay up with me late to watch Law and Order because you're too young. But then you let them stay up late and watch Law and Order because they're still too young. This does not show consistency. It doesn't show certainty. What it shows is that you're inconsistent and you're kind of all over the place. And the truth of the matter is kids will often take advantage of this. So when you set a boundary, you must be, one, willing to be consistent, but two, willing to follow through with a consequence. Now let's talk about this consequence. Consequences should be given out of love. You shouldn't just be beating on your children or putting them on punishment because you want them out of your way or because you're frustrated. You need to help them understand that consequences and discipline are a way for them to alter their behavior. But if it's not done out of love, it's going to be difficult for them to change their behavior. And it's going to be difficult for them to understand that this boundary is actually healthy for you and for them. So if you tell your children that a boundary is they have to stop using their phone for more than 2 hours a day, and then all of a sudden you notice that they've been on it for 2 hours and 30 minutes, you need to be consistent by taking away that phone, reinforcing that boundary, and giving a consequence out of love. So an example may be, now tomorrow you can't use your phone. Now, a lot of times as parents, we don't want to give consequences because ultimately they're not fun for us and they turn out to be a little bit more work for us. But without that consequence and without that consistency, our children are not going to learn. They're not going to be able to set healthy boundaries, and they're not going to understand the benefit that boundaries truly have for them as well. When you set boundaries between yourself and your children, it not only benefits you, but it also benefits your children as well. You have to remember, as parents, it is our job to be a positive role model and example. And eventually, our children will grow up and they'll be out of our care and comfort of our home. And they also need to be healthy and whole adults and individuals. But the only way that they can make that happen is if we set that example to begin with. If we are teaching them to set healthy boundaries, when they get older, now they set the intention and the expectation for how other people can treat them. And therefore, they're less likely to end up in toxic relationships. They're less likely to be taken advantage of. They're less likely to struggle with frustration because how things are going in their relationships. But it first begins with you. And so even though it takes a lot of work, even though the process may be overwhelming, we must remember that it's so worth it. So make sure you hit like and subscribe before you go. And until next time, I'll chat with you guys later. Also, check me out on social.